I would like to invite here another Mikhail Stam, and Nikoletta. Also, I will connect someone from Spain. She is going to also present her paper, Sandra. If you allow me 1 second, I will just launch my computer. Thank you. Yeah, you are all here. Hello, Sandra. We can't hear you. So maybe I should turn off. Sandra, we can't hear you right now, but I will try to fix it. I will view the speech first, Mikhail and Nikoletta. I'm hoping you'll hear us. So. It is called. I have Nikoletta. Okay, I will find it. Perhaps. Is it this one? No. Okay, maybe perhaps, Nikoletta, can we start with yours? Is it alright for you? Yeah, sure. Alright. So, I will just play yours. I would like to introduce Nikoletta very shortly. Nikoletta is a PhD student at Uppsala University, and she has been doing a fellowship at the International Communities Organization over a year right now. She's working on this very interesting topic called Raising Indigenous Women's Voices for Equal Rights and Self-Determination. And now, Nikoletta, it's your time. Thank you.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here. I've been working with ICO for the last year, but we didn't have the chance to meet in person, so I'm very excited to be here today. I would like to talk to you a bit about the background of this project and how I came up with this idea working on that. I'm not alone in this. I have two more colleagues that were working together on that. Grazia and Rosario, but unfortunately they're in different continents and different time zones, so it was hard for them to be here. So this idea came up when I was in New York working at the EU delegation to the UN, and I participated at the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues, and there I got to see how Indigenous women nowadays have managed to be there and be present and start claiming their rights openly. So ICO has been supporting this project, and last year we got to present it at the interdisciplinary meeting of Indigenous peoples in the Netherlands. So we have talked about self-determination and all that before, and the human rights and all these things involved. And I would like to give you the gender aspect of all that and focusing mostly on Indigenous women and self-determination. So I would like to start with the first main point, that is that for Indigenous women, individual and collective self-determination are both important. So a typical example is that we have many Indigenous women being victims of sexual abuse, of FGM, of forced sterilization, especially at times of conflict. So when these things happen, it's really hard for them to enjoy their right to individual self-determination. At the same time, how could indigenous peoples claim their right to collective self-determination if indigenous women cannot enjoy their rights and they're victims of major human rights violations? In this research, we want to focus on how indigenous women can claim this right for both them and indigenous peoples as a whole through their participation in politics and leadership. So, on indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we have Article 3, where the right to self-determination is recognized, but is limited to political participation and the enjoyment of economic and social development. The problem in that case is that we don't have this gender aspect. We perceive self-determination as a collective matter, and we see indigenous peoples as a homogeneous group where we cannot see the different needs that exist within these groups. And in our case, for example, is women's rights. Self-determination has been used a lot by indigenous peoples as a weapon to claim their rights, but at the same time, maybe I think that we're at the point where we perceive it as a political weapon and we forget all the things that lie behind this. So, here with this research, we want to focus on indigenous women in decision making and to focus on the fact that access of women in decision making is a challenge worldwide. It's not just a problem of indigenous women. We have reports saying that if we engage more women in peace processes, if we engage more women in politics, then we have gender mainstreaming in policies, then we can have equality, we can have justice and all that. But still, the barriers are huge, and it's not just patriarchy and all that. I think that women also many times around the globe perceive themselves as better being outside of politics and have jobs that are more silent and not that powerful. So for indigenous women, this is a huge challenge because the problem is that they have to face intersectional discrimination. So they are discriminated upon race, gender, and at the same time they're poor. So for them it's extremely hard to access education, health services. So how would it be possible for them to access decision making and leadership? This was not always the case. If we look at many indigenous communities, and before colonization, there used to be matriarchal societies where women were leading the communities, and they were taking care of the management of natural resources, etc. But after colonization, what happened is that patriarchy started prevailing in indigenous communities, and right now indigenous women are not present in decision making anymore. So we can see that we cannot talk about decolonization and historical justice if we do not solve this major issue, that is the invisibility of indigenous women. So in this research, what we did is that we identified lessons from the past, from around the globe, and now we'll just mention briefly a few of them, where indigenous women took part in leadership and decision making, and miracles happened. So I will start with the first example, which is, I think it's the most famous one from all the examples that I will mention, and it has to do with gender-based violence. So it's about the Sepulzarco trial in Guatemala, and Actually, two former military officers were convicted of crimes against humanity against 11 indigenous Kekchi women. Those women organized, and they went to the court, and they mentioned all the problems and all the violations that they experienced during the conflict. And they were subjected to sexual violence during this 30-year conflict, and it was the first time that a national court anywhere in the world considered charges of sexual slavery during an armed conflict. Then let's move to land rights, and here what I would like to mention is that for indigenous women, gender-based balance, land rights, as well as natural resource management are connected. So, for instance, if there is a conflict, this undermines the territory, and at the same time, indigenous women, as we saw, can be victims of this conflict. So, land rights and resource management are really important to indigenous women, and we have many studies on that, saying that in many cases they are the one who manage all these resources, and they are the guardians of nature. At that point, I would also like to mention this, there's this emerging legal trend called rights of nature. I don't know if you've heard of that, and there are many discussions on that, especially in the US. So according to that, nature should be seen as a subject of rights, and this is a possible way to combat climate change. So this trend is not a new trend, but it's based on how indigenous people treat nature and their special connection with nature. So especially women have this connection with nature, as through traditional knowledge they know how to handle nature and how to live with it and not exploit nature like we've been doing for years now. So on land rights, we have this case from Colombia, a branch of the National Association of Rural and Indigenous Women of Colombia. A group of women has been working to identify damages indigenous communities suffered during conflict and claim reparations benefits, including access to land. Then on natural resource management, we have this example that is from the 80s, which is not that recent, but we really wanted to include that as it's about Sami peoples and Sami women. And unfortunately, there's not many research on Sami, and I think that it's really important to mention them, as they happen to be also in Europe. So in that case, in 1981, when the Norwegian government wanted to construct this hydroelectric dam, this would lead to serious human rights violations against indigenous peoples, as they would exploit the land in a way where indigenous cannot get food or enjoy the natural resource management. So there were 14 Sami women who occupied the office of the Prime Minister, but after half an hour, the Prime Minister thought that their demands were not that interesting, so he decided to leave. But then they stayed there, and they refused to go, and in the end, they managed to reach an agreement. And this is a very this was a very important step, because it was the first time that Sami women were engaged in politics, and until now, Sami women participate in the public sphere. So in 2005, the Norwegian Sami Association recognized the actions of these women. And then last, we have another example example from Colombia, and it's about peace and conflict, and it's about the, I guess you know, this conflict between Colombia and FARC guerrillas. And indigenous women were also involved in the peace process in that. In 2013, they agitated for peace at local levels and ensured their participation at the National Summit of Women in Peace. So these are all the examples that we use, not all of them, but most of the examples that we used in this research. And I think that the biggest lesson that we were taught by this project is the problem that exists when it comes to data and disaggregated data. So this is a very big issue. We couldn't find data. In the beginning, we were planning to focus only on political participation, but we had to involve leadership as well, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to do that research, as the data was extremely limited. And while I was at this conference, at this Indigenous meeting last year, when I presented the research, an Indigenous woman from Colombia came to me and she told me that this is a problem that we keep on facing here, because we want to work on women's rights, we want to promote women's rights, but we have no data, we have no numbers, we have nothing. And I believe that today here that we are, I guess some of us or most of us, we have this research background or interest in research. I would like to mention that this is a problem, and if you are interested in contributing to solve that issue and start seeing also other perspectives in the matter and focus a bit more on disaggregated data as well and on gender mainstreaming. And that's my presentation. And one more thing to mention. So I don't know if you're interested to find more on Indigenous women and see about this intersectionality that I mentioned before and all that. You could watch this film. It's called Roma, and you can also find it on Netflix. And the actress is the first Indigenous woman that is nominated for an Academy Award this year, and I think that it's very interesting film, and you will get to see how it is being an Indigenous woman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikoletta. Now it's for Michaela, but I'm trying to send it to my. Thank you very much, Nikoletta. It was very interesting, and I know since the beginning how you are working meticulously on this research with your other colleagues. And now, Mikhail Stam. He's going to work. He's doing his master's at Rosario University, Bilbao, and Gothenburg University. Actually, it's the same master course that I have completed. It was 2 years ago, and now Mikhail is going to talk about who are the people and going to more elaborate the definition of peoples.
Yes. Well, thank you all for being here, and I'm honored to be here myself. So my question is, who are the people? Because all peoples have a right to self-determination, and we already came to the conclusion today that what a people is rather vaguely defined. Traditionally speaking, we heard it already, that there's the assumption of people being citizens as defined by borders or being part of a non-self-governed territory. And the definition is applied a bit differently in different cases. As we have already heard, political expediency does play an important role in how this right is realized, in fact. The focus of my presentation today will be non-self-governing territories, specifically Gibraltar, Western Sahara, and New Caledonia, because I feel that in these three cases, the question of who is the people is who is the people in this case, is one of the defining things in these cases. A non-self-governing territory is part of the UN decolonization legislation. It is a remnant of colonialism, and all non-self-governing territories need to exercise the right to self-determination in order... Oh, I'm not being very good with the pointer. Anyway, they need to exercise their right to self-determination in order to reach a definitive status. There used to be a lot of non-self-governing territories. Today there is still 16 left over, of which 14 are part of the UK, France, or the US. Who are their peoples? Well, a non-self-governing territory is administered by a country, and they are mostly part of this country, though in the case of Western Sahara, Morocco doesn't control the entire territory. It's also not recognized as being part of Morocco. Self-determination determination applies to the people, or to the territory, but the ones who get to vote is not the territory, but the people being mentioned as being the people of that territory. And the result is that those people who have a longer tie with a territory, as was mentioned by Mr. Freeman with the white Anglophone migration, that it is possible to move into one of these non-self-governing territories as a citizen of the administrating country, and then you get a right to vote, and thereby you get a right to vote on the future of that territory. This right to self-determination hinges on a people, but often that is also an identitarian thing. Oh, I keep doing this. It's not very useful. Anyway, it hinges on an identity, and with that migration from an administrating country, that identity is someone comes from mainland France to New Caledonia and brings their French identity. So I will go with these three cases because they all say something on how to balance these new arrivals from an administrating state with the people who were originally colonized. I will start with Western Sahara. This is also my most extensive case. It was colonized by Spain in the late 19th century, and Spain decided to leave in partly due to international pressure in the 70s, and the territory was disputed by Morocco and Mauritania. To resolve this dispute, it was brought before the International Court of Justice that was to give an advisory opinion on whether it was terra nullius, which means that it wasn't governed by anyone, and whether it had ties with Morocco and Mauritania. The conclusion was it was not terra nullius because it was administrated by a tribal administration that represented the people. There were some ties with Morocco and Mauritania, but these were not ties of continuous sovereignty over the territory. The International Court of Justice, giving its advisory opinion, stuck rather limitedly with these two questions, and it didn't provide one way forward. It did, however, stress the right to self-determination, and as most people probably know here, that right was not implemented. What happened is that Morocco and Mauritania saw these ties as a legitimation for them to invade the territory. The Frente Polisario was formed by the Sahrawi people, who are the people that lived in Western Sahara at the time, to drive out Morocco and Mauritania or stop their advance. Mauritania did retreat in 1979, but Morocco did not, and they attacked in quite great force, as we'll see territorial advance later. There's also the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic in the south that I'll show soon. They, at the moment, both administer part of the territory. Many Sahrawi were driven out of the territory. Morocco used napalm, and there's about 150,000 people now living outside of Western Sahara as refugees. And hundreds of thousands of Moroccans settled down south of the border in Western Sahara. Now, to give a bit more of a view here, this is the territory. In the top right corner you see Tindouf, that is where most of the Sahrawi refugees went, and also the headquarters of the Polisario. And as you can see, Morocco invaded in at different times. They invaded a new part of the territory, and they built a wall through the Sahara to make sure that no Sahrawi people crossed it. As you can see in the legend, there was a long fight. In 1988, there was a ceasefire set up that determined that a referendum was to be held, but this referendum wasn't defined very clearly yet. It was to be based on the 1975 census, and Saharans would be eligible to vote. But then the question becomes, who are the Saharans? And Morocco and the Polisario had different views on this. So there was an independent UN committee doing the voter registration. And over 100,000 Moroccan claims to be added to the voters list were rejected. And afterwards, Morocco rejected implementing the referendum because they weren't agreeing with who in fact was being treated as Saharan. Now, this is a bit of a jump, partly because the identification of voters took so long. In 2001, there was the idea of a Baker Plan that would give temporary autonomy to the territory, and then would give a referendum with those who had been residents in the territory for a year. This was rejected by both states because Morocco didn't want to agree to independence, and the Polisario didn't want to include the new Moroccan settlers. So the plan was rewritten. And voters residents since 1999 were on the voting lists, which included a lot of the recent Moroccan settlers. And Polisario surprisingly agreed. Algeria played an important role here because they support the Polisario and were under pressure. So the current situation is that Morocco and the Polisario now and then negotiate. There's been negotiations in Geneva this November, I think, December. Morocco has ruled out any referendum on either secession or on either independence or autonomy. The international community wants a combination of self-determination and a mutually agreed plan. And it has been said by some that these two aren't very compatible. The autonomy plan of Morocco is seen as credible basis for negotiations by the international community. It should be mentioned that Morocco has stronger ties to members of the Security Council than the Sahrawi representatives. Mostly the ceasefire is stable, but as you can see, the Polisario control relatively little territory. Now, the lessons learned from this conflict is that in the beginning, the transfer of Moroccans into Western Sahara could be ignored, and the voting list was set up based on those who were in the territory before Morocco invaded. But later, the rights of Moroccans were to be recognized, and the length of residence was an important topic of conflict here. So the question then becomes, how do you balance between those who have lived in a territory for a longer time and those who recently arrived? New Caledonia gives a possible answer to this. They recently had a referendum on independence in 2018. They have a rather closed voting list. One needs to either have been a resident for more than 10 years before 1998, or a resident of New Caledonia for more than 20 years. This gives a main problem that there is second-class citizens who are French people who moved to New Caledonia a few years ago and can't vote as representing Caledonia in, for instance, the French Assembly or in other elections. But it does give more influence to the native Kanak of to the indigenous Kanak people of New Caledonia. And the referendum had 56% in vote in favor of staying in France. That was far less than projected. So it does show that this type of measure is effective in augmenting the voice of indigenous people. And in the case of Gibraltar, that is contested between Spain and the UK. There have been, it has been part of the UK for 300 years, and there's been 2 referenda in the past decades. Both of them, the first was on joining Spain, and the second was on co-administration. Both of them were decisively rejected in a vote. And one might say that this is a clear expression of the will of the people of Gibraltar, but Spain claims that the people of Gibraltar are the descendants of the people who were driven out 300 years ago, and the UN has actually condemned the first referendum as being against its own decolonization framework. So that is basically the question that I wanted to leave you with. Where to strike a balance. My main goal of today is to start a conversation, not necessarily provide my own answers. So I think that I'll leave it at that.
If you would like that, you can add like last a minute.
I'll keep it
Okay, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Yes, population transfer is one of the risks of sub-Saharan nation we can conclude. I will try one more time linking Sandra. There will be also support from the IT. They completed their check. Let's try her. Hello, Sandra. We don't hear you. We still have the same problem, but I know you check. Can you hear me? You hear me? I'm right here on the back. So I think this is an IT. Yeah, I think there should be support. He told me he's coming.
Yeah,
Yeah. Is it that one we were trying to fix it? Sandra?
Hello.
Ah, perfect. There you Alright. Okay, thank you. Sandra, I think you can.
No, I can hear you.
Yeah, you
Sorry.
can see me from here, I guess.
Oh,
Can you speak into the microphone?
hello.
Okay, can you hear
Hear
me?
me? Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your patience. We'll just fix this issue. And welcome again.
Thank you.
Sandra Malagón actually going to present her paper, which is a result of a research on inclusive innovation in eco-technologies for indigenous communities, self-determination. And she's actually doing this research with two other colleagues who are not here today to present. But now I will leave the scene for you and feel free to start.
Okay, thank you, Kubra. I will share my screen with you. Can you hear? Can you?
Yes, everyone can hear you.
But you can. Wait a minute. I will share.
You want to share the screen? All right.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you see it?
No, let me check. We can't.
I don't know why.
Try it again, please.
Now you can see it?
Yes, I can see.
Okay,
Yeah.
I will begin. Well, thank you, everyone. Today I will talk about how responsible innovation in ecotechnology could contribute to the indigenous communities' self-determination. My presentation has two parts. The first one is conceptual, and the second one is an example about how to put in practice these concepts. The first important concept is ecotechnology. And for us, ecotechnology are devices or procedures resolving the user's real necessities in different contexts. They promote local and decentralized capabilities, encourage the use of native resources, increasing self-sustainability, and decreasing the use of external fuels, becoming reachable for everyone in all the innovation process, preventing the exclusion of the poorest. It is not about ancient technologies or incomplete ones. It's about technologies that answer to real necessities, determined by the context. One technology could be useful in one place, but couldn't be in others. So the inclusion of the users for us is central for ecotechnology innovation. So let's go to see what does mean for us inclusion. And inclusion for us is based in two central concepts: responsiveness and anticipation. A strong vision of inclusion, understanding the agents involved as societal actors and not as stakeholders, based on the idea of responsiveness, that is, the ability to respond to the actors. Starting from von Schomburg and Stilgoff, societal actors are agents with the ability to be part of the decision-making process about the positive and negative impacts in a given context, and that they can share the responsibility and develop a response to external evolutions caused by the environmental or other actors. On the other hand, anticipation is the construction of future shared visions. That is, the construction of what future we want, and this is an agreement, and the consequences of this are action in the present for to have this shared future. This implies changes in the technical aspect of innovation, but above all, social transformation in who and how they make decisions, and therefore what responsibilities they assume. This is not based on the management of the impacts of technology, but on how the plurality of factors decides the goals and how manage the possible positive and negative effects. The difference between participation and inclusion is that in participation, one actor or few actors define the goals of the future that they want, and after that invite to the others as stakeholders to participate. Inclusion is the common construction of the goals and the future that we want. So, how this can work for the self-determination of indigenous communities? The first question is about the lacks. Are two barriers for inclusive innovation. The first one is differences in participation possibilities. Participation conditions will not be equal for different social sectors. In these circumstances, we can say that the conditions for scientists or decision makers are favorable in comparison to the others. We can see that in many formal situations, white, middle class, or better educated people generally act it is their have the right to speak. Their minds and their words are communicated with authority. On the other hand, those who belong to other, less privileged groups feel intimidated by all the formal requirements and all the procedural rules. Therefore, they prefer not express themselves or they do it feeling like their contributions are disorganized or not important. Assertiveness norms, fight spirit, and respect for the rules of competition are powerful silencers of the groups considered to be in a condition of cultural difference or inequality, for example, rural inhabitants or indigenous people. The second barrier is incommensurability of languages and standards. The incommensurability of languages means that vocabulary used in paradigms and conceptual frameworks can carry different meanings, and different concepts can influence the meaning of a word in a different area. A change in a concept implies changing a number of percepts and rules about the word, changing the interpretation criteria relating to the concept. This is a product of change in the way of viewing the world, and this view is global and it causes changes not only in interpretation of concepts through vocabulary, but also has a direct impact in practice. Following this idea, incommensurability of standards refers that the frameworks of each community delimited the way they interact with the world. Followers of different paradigms have different standards and definitions, and this causes disagreement standards and disagreement over which problems are valid and which are not, as well as valid methods to resolve these problems. This incommensurability is also found outside science. There is no shortage of programs for the implementation of technologies to help people in vulnerable situations, which have failed due to lack of interest among users. Maybe the developers of these programs should have asked themselves if the solution and problems were valid from users' point of view before imposing solutions. And well, these both barriers are related with a concept developed mainly by Amanda Fricker, that is epistemic injustice. And this is, the epistemic injustice is the distributive unfairness in respect of epistemic goods, such as information or education. And Amanda Fricker divides into kinds of injustice. The first one is testimonial injustice, and occurs when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word. And hermeneutical injustice occurs at a priori stage when a gap in collective interpretative resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their social experience. An example of the first one might be that the police don't believe you because your skin color. An example of the second might be that you suffer sexual harassment in a culture that still lacks the critical concepts. Well, the lines to achieve inclusions very important for get the real inclusions. So the lines to overcome barriers to participation revolve around 3 items. The first one is the creation of spaces for dialogue. The second one is interpretation, and the third is mediations. So the first refers to spaces where dialogue between different communities can take place, addressing the problem of different participation possibilities between groups. This space must have characteristics that generate confidence for actors to express opinions, but also to respect contrary viewpoints. Interpretation addresses the problem of the incommensurability of languages and standards. There are terms and relations between them that rural communities and scientists don't share. On one side, there are the technical terms of scientific research. On the other, there are regional terms of rural communities, or even a partial or total lack of Spanish language abilities in the case of Latin America. The understanding of different groups gives a plus to the evaluation of the relevance, credibility, and legitimacy of the information. Relevance depends on context and local needs. Credibility depends on the source of the information, and legitimacy is determined by the level of participation. Those who believe the information credible and relevant can still reject its illegitimate as the final decision is made. Finally, mediation addresses the problem of dissent, allowing actors to reach agreement and promoting respectful dialogue as conflict removes the risk of losing open participative dialogue. This can have negative effects affecting the epistemic and moral connections between the actors, raising the possibility that they can doubt of the credibility of the other participants, not taking into account their experience, leading to a loss of objectivity and valuable knowledge. Well, and now I will talk very briefly about a project where we try to put in practice the inclusive innovation. This project is about sustainable indigenous pottery. And well, Santa Fe de la Laguna is the place where we put in practice this project. It's a small indigenous community in Mexico, which is the main pottery producer in the area of Michoacán. They still use colors and greta, a type of clay that functions as a gloss paint with lead, as well as traditional firewood skins that have too high costs in environmental terms and health terms too, affecting artisans and the consumers alike. And in this project, instead to think and develop a priori solution for Santa Fe potters, we include them. We develop spaces for truth because usually they don't feel confident to talk. We translate scientific and technical terms for everyone can understand and use. And we develop with them analytical tools for understanding what means for health and environment the use of lead and inefficient kilns. After that, they were able to decide and express what they need and want. The university and NGO, before this process, got an idea of a big kiln with very high power, very efficient, but expensive and difficult to build without specialized knowledge. After that, all the group developed a small kiln, very cheap, that can be built with local materials by the community bricklayers, and also efficient and safe. All this because women porters want to preserve their traditional way to work, but without race, and getting high control of their resources and technology for their work. And I will present a very small video for you to get an idea of the project.
Sandra, if you send me the link,
Sorry.
if you can send me the link of the video, I think
yes.
it's much clearer to see it.
Okay.
Because there are some bugs in the video when you share from your own screen. Thank you.
Okay. Ready.
Yeah, but
I don't
also,
know if I need to stop.
yeah, can
to
you
share
stop
my
the
screen?
exactly? First, don't share your screen. Thank you.
I don't know how.
Oh, really?
I don't know how can I stop.
Okay, I can give you a call.
Oh my god.
If you want, I can give you a call again.
Yes, please,
Okay,
because I
better.
can. Okay.
Oh, it's there. She sent it.
Okay, she's done already.
De corazón, yo invito a toda la gente que nos vea a través de esta cámara. Los invitamos a que nos conozcan. Pues aquí los recibimos con los brazos abiertos y el corazón abierto, y para que ustedes mismos moldean el barro, las piezas que a ustedes les guste. Estas manos van a formar esa pieza que ustedes pidan. De corazón vamos a trabajar. Los invito. Gracias. Bienvenidos aquí, Santa Fe.
Hello again. Oh. Hello again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We have seen the video. Thank you for sharing that one.
Okay, thank you for seeing. And well, I think it's not necessary.
Yeah, because you need to conclude it in 1 to 2 minutes, actually.
Yes, I need just 30 seconds. So in
Thank you.
conclusion, eco-technologies could be safe, efficient, and friendly choices to promote the development and improve quality of life in indigenous areas, while contributing in meaningful way to creation of means for sustainable life, but cannot be in an imposive top-down way, So inclusive innovation as a way to innovate with and not for the most disadvantaged people, and collaborating with them to construct a plural future. So thanks so much for hearing me.
Okay, thank you very much. We really enjoyed your presentation. It was very lovely. Thank you. I want you to stay here with us because there might be some questions to you. Is it all right?
Okay, yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, I actually have directly one question to you. Is this Laguna in Mexico, is it the only populations, indigenous groups that you have been working with to come up with the research results?
Yes, this is a very recent project, and we work at a pilot project in Santa Fe because it's the biggest population of indigenous potteries. But in Mexico, we got another communities with the same problems. So this could be the first step for works in other communities in the same way to innovate with them.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience to all the panelists? We have Nikoletta. She presented her topic on indigenous women from different regions, from Europe, Finland to Colombia. And then Mikhail, he gave example from, again, Western Sahara, Gibraltar, and bring more discussions around the peoples. Any questions? I know we, yeah, all right, we have Kenza.
So I have a question for Nikoletta. You spoke about how conflict can often omit the needs of indigenous women in population. I just wanted to bring up two papers who kind of offer an alternative perspective. One from Adams and Melinda, who talk about the election of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf as the first African president, of Liberia, and also want to talk about Kramer, who writes a book called Civil War is Not a Stupid Thing. Both advance the view that sometimes out of conflict and transition, women can actually become critical actors. So in the case of Rwanda, for example, we see now a huge proportion of women in parliament, and in 2005, when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected in Liberia, it was post-conflict. And so both of those authors talk about the effect that conflict can actually have in showing the role that women can play both in warfare but also in the economy whilst conflict is going on. And I just wanted to know what your take was on that, sort of the alternative perspective of civil war as sort of uplifting almost the image of women as playing a necessary role both in fighting but also in behind the scenes.
Yeah. So,
Nikoletta, if you can speak with the speaker, then
sure.
Sandra can hear. You couldn't hear. Okay, so this question was meant to Nikoletta. Now you can listen to Nikoletta, and if you would like to contribute, if you can wrap up the question with one sentence.
okay, so
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
it's better for you to wrap it up.
Yeah, but do you know where is the microphone? Microphone is there.
Thank you.
Okay, with very short sentence, Kenza, please.
Sorry, my question was just wanting to know your opinion on the alternative argument that is sometimes put out there by both Adams and Melinda, which is a paper on the election of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the past president of Liberia, who was the first African head of state elected, and it was also regarding the high proportion of women in parliament in Rwanda, both which came after conflict, and both authors who speak about civil war as sometimes uplifting the image of women, both in their role during warfare, but also behind the scenes, and that can actually have positive impact on gender participation in politics.
Well, you mentioned some African cases.
Yeah.
The first one on Sherlock in Liberia.
Yeah.
This case, yeah, it's true, I've read that, but it's been also widely criticized, and she was criticized for not promoting women's rights enough. And then for Rwanda, yeah, that's a case in Africa as well, and in other countries, you will see Seychelles as well. They have changed many things in their legislation as well that helped. So they have now quotas, and women can access political participation and all that. And actually there is a report that you can find online from Make Every Woman Count. It is an organization that I'm working with, and we have monitored all the what happened in Africa and African women's participation during this decade. The difference though between what's going on in Africa and indigenous women is that if we see it, like if we see the African case, because we're looking on data on indigenous women in Africa, we didn't find anything on that. So we don't know if there are indigenous women in parliaments in Africa. And then in other parts of the world, right now they have started gradually being in the parliaments. There are some examples from the Americas, but still they are very marginalized. And I think the problem is that they struggle more than other women. For example, in Africa, yeah, there are challenges for all African women. But indigenous women have also to overcome other barriers, like I mentioned, the intersectional discrimination and all that. So we come again to what I mentioned before, that we need data on indigenous women, because maybe they are there, but we just don't know it. And especially in the case of Africa, because we worked on that last year, that was a huge barrier, that we couldn't find data on indigenous women.
Thank you. And would you like to contribute, Sandra? No. We don't have a good. That's fine.
Are there any other questions? Thank you.
My question is to Michael. You were bringing up interesting case studies and examples of places where there's still ongoing self-determination claims that are in contrast with each other. Most all of them are a result of colonization or imperialism of the past. And yet, I feel like people are very skeptical to use the word colony when referring to Nova Caledonia or Gibraltar or similar situations, but rather they see them as our territory. So is that why these particular cases are different from the rest of the decolonization countries, the decolonization process that happened in the 60s and in the 70s? Or do you feel there are other aspects that make these cases a bit more difficult to apply the self-determination through decolonization than other examples that we've had in the past? What makes it so complicated in these situations?
Thank you for the question. I think that one of the main issues that is going on is that in many of these territories there's been, as a result of colonialism, a large transfer of population already, and that therefore when people think of colonization, they think of one people ruling another people. And in these cases that is happening, but simultaneously there is also a group that very strongly identifies with the country that colonized and that is representative, especially in Gibraltar, of the people currently living there. And I think that's why it's also harder to apply the current decolonization measures there, because it's been too successful, the colonization. And I think that it's, in those cases, it's perhaps even more similar to, for instance, the Russification of the Baltics, whereby there was a large transfer of Russians into the Baltic countries, and how to deal with that, than to other to previous cases of decolonization, but I think that it remains a very thorny question because colonialism has happened, and you do need to find a solution that doesn't cause more injustice.
I don't know if it's relevant or not, but there is one indigenous community in Europe which is both visible and invisible, humiliated and disregarded, and in fact were actually major victims of the Holocaust as well. This is the Roma Sinti community across Europe, and often not mentioned. Mentioned but not mentioned. Regarded but disregarded. Humiliated, humiliated, humiliated. I think it seems to me that this is a community which perhaps needs to be made visible, because this platform is perhaps the best platform for a community like that. An indigenous community, by the way, they have to be regarded as indigenous. If Hungarians can be regarded as indigenous, despite being outsiders, why can't people like the Roma, Sinti people? They're indigenous too, to Poland, to Hungary, to Belarus, to Germany, to Austria, to Italy, and to all these other nations. So I think perhaps we should make them visible too in our discussions. The reason I raised this question actually was related to a very interesting comment that Dr. Mare raised, which was she talked about political taboos in relation to the issue of individual or self-discrimination issues in Europe. And it seems to me I can understand why this is a political taboo, because of the presence of the Roma Sinti community in Europe, it seems to me.
Thank you very much. Anyone wants to contribute on that comment? Yes, Tanya?
Thank you. I'm very happy that you mentioned Roma, because the Roma are my comparative group in my research. And you're absolutely correct. Many times the Roma are omitted, and it refers to indigenous groups. They forget about that portion. They forget about how they've migrated and many other factors that go with that. Is that on? Is that on? Oops. So yes, the Roma is part of my research with in that specific area. And more so, I've highlighted on the children of the Roma in specific areas as it relates to the indigenous to different areas throughout Europe.
In most of the cases, Roma people are considered as minority groups, and in the beginning of in the first panel, actually, we mentioned that one. I think it was James Summers's presentation. The human rights law and international law considers some groups under the minority groups. Then we cannot end up with the other articles, which are the first one on right to self-determination. And also some scholars, they see that self-determination, the claims that are coming from the groups for self-determination shouldn't be linked to having a country, and there are very different views on considering who is a group, who is a tribe, who is a group that can claim for self-determination. So since it's a very vague issue, it's very difficult to actually answer this. And any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask Michael whether you think the probable withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union will make a difference to the future of Gibraltar.
Well, that's a very good question. I think it will make a difference, but I'm not sure whether it will make a difference I think it will make the difference that the EU will be more likely to stand behind Spain in its viewpoint on Gibraltar, and that it therefore might start calling Gibraltar a colony, as Spain has done, or at least harden its position. But I do think that the people currently living in Gibraltar, they voted to stay in the European Union overwhelmingly, but in both votes with the one transferring them to Spain and the one with co-rule were rejected by 98 and 99% of the population. So it is really not regarded as an option by the Gibraltarians, and due to the Peace of Utrecht in 1715, Gibraltar can't become independent. So I think that the status quo might hold on longer.